In October 1972, a small passenger plane with 45 people on board was headed from Montevideo to Santiago. Among the passengers were a youth team of Uruguayan rugby players, their friends and relatives. The flight was supposed to follow a complex route, first south, then around the Andes, and only then toward the capital of Chile. A direct flight over the mountains was considered too risky. However, that day everything went differently. The pilot turned north prematurely. The plane clipped a mountain slope, broke into pieces, and slid down the snow like a sled. In the first few minutes of the tragedy, 12 people died. 5 were considered missing, but they were soon found dead. For those who survived, a real hell began. They found themselves at an altitude of 3,600 meters, in the middle of an icy wasteland, where there was no food, no shelter, and not even their familiar idea of life. Most of the passengers had never seen snow before, and now they had to fight for survival in conditions that an unprepared person simply cannot withstand. In the first few days, 3 more people died, some from wounds, some from the cold. The survivors had only one source of hope, a radio. They built an antenna and were able to catch the news. But it was a radio that delivered a terrible blow. On the 8th day after the disaster, the announcer declared, "The search for the plane has been called off." Against the white background of snow, the fuselage was too inconspicuous, and the rescuers decided there was nothing more to look for. For the survivors, this message was almost a death sentence. They understood. Now they could only rely on themselves. Many fell into despair. But it was then that something incredible happened. The team captain, Nando Pardue, whom everyone thought was dead, suddenly showed signs of life. He had lain unconscious for 2 days in the frost, and doctors would later say it was the cold that saved his life. His body slowed down its processes, the brain hemorrhage stopped, and his body got a chance to recover. They obtained water by melting snow on the metal sheathing, but there was no food at all. The 10th day without food became a turning point. Nando, exhausted from hunger, confessed to his friend Roberto, "I'm looking at the body of the dead pilot, and I'm thinking about eating him." Roberto did not condemn him. He just said, "You're not crazy. Many people are thinking about this." They were faced with a choice that was impossible to make calmly, to die themselves or to violate all moral and religious prohibitions. Most of the passengers were Catholics, and the idea of cannibalism contradicted everything they had been taught. But the bodies of the dead lay nearby, and they had less and less strength. Then they remembered the rituals of ancient tribes and the words of the gospel. "This is my body." Gradually, they came to understand this was not a desecration, but the only way to survive. Some were never able to cross that line. One of the youths died from exhaustion, weighing only 24 kilograms in his last hours. But the others decided to eat the bodies of the deceased. They touched the pilot first, considering him guilty of the disaster and, in a sense, a stranger. It seemed like things couldn't get any worse. But a month and a half later, a new misfortune occurred. An avalanche came down on the camp. In an instant, many were buried under the snow and 8 people died. Those who survived felt that their fate was finally sealed. One of the survivors said, "To our families, we are already dead. Now we are also buried here. Let's just die in peace." But Nando Pardue did not agree. His words became the turning point. "I want to go back to my father. I will not give up." With these words, he began to dig a tunnel and led the people out. At that time, only 16 people remained alive. They understood they could no longer sit and wait. They began to make sorties into the mountains to find out if they could go further. The snow gave way under their feet, and the air was thin. But they did not give up. They made makeshift snowshoes out of suitcase lids, and this gave them a chance to move faster. So, step by step, they still found the tail of the plane. Inside were things, including a camera. They took a few pictures, leaving them in case the bodies were ever found. And it was then that Nando and Roberto had an idea, to try to get out on their own, cross the ridge and find help. It seemed to them that there should be green valleys of Chile beyond the mountains. In fact, they were in the very heart of the Andes. At this point, the story takes a new, even more dramatic turn. 3 people decided to go into the unknown. Nando Pardue, Roberto Canessa, and their companion named Tintin. They knew the journey could be deadly, but staying in the fuselage meant dying slowly. They made a primitive sleeping bag on the plane's sheathing and insulation, so they wouldn't freeze to death at night. The ascent was much more difficult than they had anticipated. Without preparation, without mountaineering experience, without real equipment, they walked through deep snow, inhaling the thin air. Every step was incredibly difficult. Time dragged on endlessly. It seemed that the summit was unattainable. Finally, after long hours of agonizing climbing, they reached the crest, and what appeared before their eyes took away their strength. Instead of the promised valleys and greenery, an endless chain of new, even higher peaks opened up behind a mountain ridge. It was a moment of despair. Nando fell onto the snow and said, "We are doomed." But Roberto did not let them give up. "We have survived together so many times," he said. "Let's take one more step. Even if we die, we will do it together." This short but decisive statement became the impulse that made them continue. The third companion returned to his comrades, while Nando and Roberto went on alone. Their journey lasted 9 days. 9 days full of torment and struggle. They covered 37 miles on a map, a journey that was akin to a heroic feat in those conditions. They were losing weight literally before their eyes. Nando lost another 4 kilograms, Roberto 8. Their bodies were barely holding up, but their inner determination pushed them forward. When they finally began to descend, a valley appeared ahead. A river flowed there, and the snow line was left behind. For the first time in many weeks, they felt a temperature above zero. It seemed that nature itself had given them a sign. Now they had a chance. But the trials did not end there. The meat supplies they had taken with them spoiled. Roberto became seriously ill with dysentery. Nando, with almost no strength, took him on his shoulders and continued the journey. On the 9th day of their wanderings, an event occurred that turned everything around. In the distance, they saw a man on horseback, a local Chilean shepherd. For them, it was like a vision. When the rider approached, they could barely speak, but they were able to explain who they were. The shepherd gave them food and water, and then went for help. This was the beginning of their rescue. A few days later, helicopters were sent into the mountains. Nando and Roberto, despite their exhaustion, accompanied the rescuers to show them the way to the crash site. There, under the snowdrifts, their comrades remained, who were still waiting for a miracle. After 71 days after the disaster, the last 14 survivors were lifted into helicopters and taken down to the valleys. The world finally learned about the miracle in the Andes. This story shocked the entire world. Newspapers wrote about it on their front pages. Some were shocked by the truth that they ate the bodies of the dead in order to live. Others admired the willpower and cohesion of those who managed to endure. But most importantly, people saw an example of human determination, an example of how even when there are no chances, you can fight and win. When the helicopters delivered the last survivors to Chile, the world already knew what had happened in the Andes. But the details became known later, and they caused a storm of emotions. At first, many could not believe that young people, Catholics, raised in strict traditions, had decided on an extreme step: to eat the bodies of the deceased. Newspapers came out with loud headlines where the words cannibalism and horror stood out to the reader. Some condemned them, calling them sinners. But most understood this was not a choice, but a desperate necessity. The survivors themselves said that it was excruciatingly difficult for them to cross this barrier. They ate those they loved, friends, classmates, relatives. For them, it was not an act of cruelty, but a way to preserve memory and pass on life in their minds. It was akin to a sacrifice that the deceased accepted so that others could continue to live. The story was named the Miracle of the Andes. It immediately became a symbol of man's struggle with nature, and at the same time, a symbol of faith, courage, and friendship. A monument to the 29 deceased was later erected at the crash site. Every year on December 22nd, the survivors gathered together. For them, it is not just the anniversary of the tragedy. It is a day of remembrance for those who did not live to see the rescue, and a day of gratitude for the fact that they managed to return home. They pray, remember, and share memories. For Nando Pardu, this story became a turning point in his life. He returned home and learned that his father, unable to bear the grief, had destroyed all the family's belongings, having decided that his son had died. Neither his mother nor his sister was alive then, but Nando did not break. He built a career as a race car driver, became a businessman, and then a motivational speaker, talking about the power of the human spirit and the fight for life. Thousands of people listened to his speeches, and each time there was silence in the hall, because he spoke about what he had experienced himself. Roberto Canessa also found his purpose. He became a well-known cardiologist and dedicated his life to saving others. And every time he looked at his patients, he remembered those he could not save back then in the mountains. The other survivors also chose different paths, but they all had one thing in common. They were never the same again. Those 71 days forever changed their ideas about life, about faith, about what is truly important. Over time, this story ceased to be just news about a disaster. It turned into a legend. Books were written about it, and feature and documentary films were made. In schools and universities, it was cited as an example of what the human body and spirit are capable of. In survival textbooks, the miracle of the Andes took a special place. And yet the main legacy of this story is not in numbers or in chronicles. It is in the fact that 16 people proved, even in the most hopeless circumstances, a person can rise above fear, above despair, above what seemed impossible. This tragedy became a mirror for all humanity. Some saw horror in it, some faith, but everyone recognized it was a heroic feat, committed not for the sake of fame, but for the sake of life. In December 1972, when helicopters lifted the last survivors from the icy plateau of the Andes, the world was shocked. It was not just the rescue of a group of young people. It was a clash of humanity with questions that are not so easy to answer. What does survival mean? Where is the line between morality and instinct? And is a person capable of withstanding what seems impossible? Many decades have passed since then, but interest in this story has not waned. It is retold again and again in books, films, lectures, articles. And each time, something new is found in it. Some see tragedy first and foremost, others a miracle. But in any case, no one remains indifferent. This disaster became an example of the fact that a huge reserve of strength is hidden in a person. At an altitude of 3,600 meters, without food, without warmth, amidst the frozen silence of the mountains, 16 people proved. As long as a heart beats, as long as there is at least a grain of hope, you can fight. Today, many of the survivors themselves say, they are not heroes. They were ordinary young men who loved sports, dreamed of the future, laughed, and enjoyed life. But it was in these ordinary people that something extraordinary manifested itself. Their story reminds us, heroism is born not from strength, but from choice. And their choice was a terrible one, to accept death or to take a step that contradicted morality and faith. They took that step. They ate the bodies of friends and relatives to preserve life. This is not a heroic feat in the usual sense, but was a decision that allowed 16 to return home. The world called their rescue the miracle of the Andes. But the miracle was not only in the fact that the helicopters found them after 71 days. The real miracle is in their inner fortitude, in the stubbornness of Nando Pardue, who said, "I will return to my father," in the determination of Roberto Canessa, who insisted, "Let's take one more step," in the faith of those who sat in the cold fuselage, hugging each other to keep warm. Today, looking back, one can say, this story has become a kind of lesson for all of humanity. It showed that the most terrible trials can reveal the best qualities in people: loyalty, friendship, courage, and a willingness to sacrifice for others. And every time the 16 survivors gather on December 22nd, they remember not only those they lost, but also that life is too precious to give up. The disaster flight number 571 has entered the history textbooks. But for those who were there, it is not just a page in a book. It is their destiny, their pain, their victory, and perhaps the main conclusion that this story left for the world is a person can withstand even when against some of the elements, the cold, and death itself. But for this, you need something that is stronger than fear. This is hope, and as long as it exists, a miracle is possible.